Hello, and thanks for listening. I find that at my age, telling stories is one of the few things you get better at. Maybe it's just practice, or maybe when you've seen enough, you finally understand how the pieces fit together. This story, this one is about my dearest friend, Eleanor. It's about a promise I made, and the man who tried to make me break it. It's a story about how sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't the ones with claws and fangs, but the ones with teeth so white they blind you and a smile so wide you can't see the hook at the end of the line. Stick with me, and I'll tell you how I used a 72-year-old man's greatest assets, patience, and a long memory, to burn a righteous man's kingdom to the ground. The lawyer's office smelled of lemon polish and quiet, expensive grief. It was the kind of place designed to make you feel small, to make the reading of a will feel less like a family affair and more like a corporate transaction. The chairs were hard leather, the table a vast, dark expanse of mahogany, and the air was chilled to the precise temperature of uncomfortable formality. I sat there, my old tweed jacket feeling a little too warm, and watched Pastor Dean Albright across the table. He was a masterpiece of pastoral presentation. His hair was silver at the temples, but thick and perfectly coiffed. His suit was a tasteful charcoal gray, not too flashy, but you could tell the fabric was quality. But it was his face that always got me. The tan was too even for a man who supposedly spent his days tending to a flock in our often overcast corner of the world. And the teeth, they were brilliant, a row of perfect porcelain veneers that shone with an almost aggressive holiness when he smiled. And he smiled a lot. That was his signature, the wide, reassuring smile that made little old ladies open their checkbooks and estranged families feel a flicker of hope. At Eleanor's funeral last month, that smile had been deployed with military precision. He'd stood at the pulpit, his voice a resonant baritone, and painted a picture of a woman I barely recognized. His Eleanor was a saint, a beatific soul whose only thought in her final days was securing her place in the heavenly kingdom by supporting his church. He spoke of her serene detachment from worldly things, her divine clarity. I remember sitting in the back pew, my hands clenched into fists in my pockets, tasting bile. Serene detachment. The Eleanor I knew had spent her last coherent months in a state of quiet, desperate anguish over her only child. And now, here we were, me, Lawrence, a retired civil engineer who'd known Eleanor since our kids were in kindergarten together. Across from me, the pastor oozing sanctimonious sorrow, and at the head of the table, a lawyer I'd never seen before, a man named Patterson, with nervous, darting eyes and a habit of glancing at Pastor Albright before he spoke, as if for approval. Eleanor's estranged daughter, Chloe, wasn't here. She'd been told by Patterson that her presence wasn't required or advised. That should have been my first clue that this was a demolition, not a reading. Patterson cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. He shuffled some paper. I didn't say a word, I just looked at him. I looked at the perfect teeth, the expensive suit, the confident piety. I thought of Eleanor just 2 months ago, sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, the Afghan my late wife Martha had knitted for her draped over her knees. Her hands, gnarled with age, were twisting a tissue into shreds. There were tears in her eyes. She'd been talking about Chloe. I was so stubborn, Lawrence, she'd whispered, her voice papery and thin. So proud. We fought over something so stupid, her husband, I didn't approve. And I let it go on for years. Now I just want to hear her voice. I want her to know. I want her to have the house, to raise her own children in it, just like I did. Will you make sure of that, Lawrence? Will you promise me? I had promised her. I had held her frail hand and told her I would. And now this man, this smiling wolf, was telling me she'd found peace by throwing that promise, her daughter and her entire life's legacy, into a collection plate. My shock wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was cold and heavy, a block of granite settling in my gut. I stood up, the legs of my chair making a harsh scraping sound against the polished floor. I didn't look at the lawyer. I looked directly at Pastor Albright. I let him see the engineer in my eyes, the man who deals in stress points and load-bearing truths. I saw his smile falter for just a fraction of a second. He wasn't used to being looked at like a structural problem. "Thank you for your time," I said, my voice as flat and level as a concrete foundation. Then I turned and walked out of that cold, quiet office, the pastor's oily words echoing behind me. But I wasn't hearing them. I was hearing Eleanor's plea. I was feeling the weight of my promise, and deep down in a part of me that had been dormant for a very long time, I felt the first stirrings of a cold, calculated rage. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. At that moment it was about a debt, and I always pay my debts. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and gray pavement. I don't remember a single turn I made, but my old Volvo found its way back to my quiet, empty house on autopilot, the same way it had for the past 10 years since Martha passed. I parked in the garage, turned off the engine, and just sat there in the silence, the smell of gasoline and old lawn equipment, a familiar comfort. The silence in the car was a mercy compared to the noise in my head. Sound mind and body. The phrase kept replaying, a mocking, vicious little loop. Sound mind. Eleanor had been on a cocktail of painkillers and sedatives that would have confused a man half her age. I'd visited her the week that codicil was supposedly signed. She'd mistaken me for her late husband, Frank, for a full 10 minutes, asking me if I'd remembered to fix the gutter. I'd played along, not wanting to upset her. Sound mind. The arrogance of the lie was breathtaking. I finally went inside, shrugging off my jacket and hanging it on the hook by the door, a habit ingrained over 40 years of marriage. The house was tidy, ordered. I've always been a man who finds solace in order, a place for everything and everything in its place. It's how I think. It's how I solve problems. You lay out all the pieces, you identify the anomalies, and you trace them back to the source. I walked into my study, the room that had once been my sanctuary of blueprints and stress calculations, and now held my books, my memories, and a well-stocked bar cart. I poured a measure of good scotch into a heavy crystal tumbler, one of a set Frank and Eleanor had given Martha and me for our 25th anniversary. I held the cool glass, but didn't drink. I just stood by the window looking out at the manicured lawn of my neighbor, a man I barely knew. My mind started to drift, pulling up memories of Eleanor not as a frail, dying woman, but as the force of nature she'd been. I remembered her at a PTA meeting 30 years ago, taking on the school board over a budget cut to the arts program. She hadn't shouted. She just stood there, armed with facts and figures, and calmly, systematically dismantled their arguments until they had no choice but to concede. She was a fighter. She would never ever have surrendered her legacy without one. Then another memory surfaced, sharper this time. It was from about a year ago, not long after Pastor Albright had started making house calls. Eleanor had invited me over for tea. The pastor was just leaving as I arrived. He'd given me that blinding smile and a firm handshake, his palm a little too moist. "Taking good care of our Eleanor," he'd said, a proprietary tone in his voice that had rubbed me the wrong way even then. When I went inside, Eleanor seemed different, flustered. There was a new book on her coffee table, a glossy paperback with Pastor Albright's face on the cover. Heavenly Investments, Securing Your Eternal Legacy. "He's a very dynamic man, isn't he?" she'd said, not quite meeting my eye. "He's certainly energetic," I'd replied, picking up the book. I flipped through it. It was full of vague platitudes about faith and prosperity, peppered with testimonials from congregants who had seen their lives blessed after making significant donations. It felt less like a book about God and more like a timeshare sales pitch. "He says the church is planning a new wing," Eleanor continued, her voice a little too bright. For community outreach. A soup kitchen. A youth center. He says a legacy isn't what you leave to your family, it's what you build for your community. Your legacy is Chloe, I'd said, perhaps a little too bluntly, and her children. A shadow had passed over her face. She'd looked down at her hands. Chloe doesn't want anything from me. That's not true, Elle. And you know it. You just need to be the first one to pick up the phone. She'd changed the subject then, but I remembered the exchange perfectly. It was a seed of an idea he had planted in her mind, that her earthly family was a lost cause, but a heavenly family was waiting to embrace her, for a price. He had been grooming her, isolating her from her own history, her own instincts, and replacing them with his. I finally took a sip of the scotch. The burn was sharp, clarifying. This wasn't just a simple case of a sweet-talking preacher getting lucky. This was a strategy, a cold, deliberate campaign targeting a lonely, vulnerable woman. And the most sickening part was that he'd used her deepest regret, her estrangement from Chloe, as his primary weapon. He'd convinced her that the only way to atone for failing her daughter was to abandon her completely. It was a piece of psychological jujitsu so perverse, so twisted that it was almost brilliant. My mind went to my own will tucked away in my safe deposit box. It was, like Eleanor's original, a simple document. Everything to my son, Michael, a good man with a family of his own out in Oregon. When Martha and I wrote our wills together, sitting at this very desk, it wasn't a sad occasion. It was an act of love. It was our final conversation with our son, our way of saying, we took care of things. We trust you. Go on and live a good life. It was about providing, protecting. It was a parent's final duty. What Albright had done was a desecration of that sacred act. He had turned an act of love into an act of acquisition. The phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. I looked at the caller ID. It was Chloe. I hesitated for a moment, steeling myself, then answered. Her voice was small, fragile. Lawrence, Patterson's office called me. They told me. There was no anger in her voice, just a profound, hollowed-out sadness. That was almost worse. Anger I could have worked with. This was the sound of a final door slamming shut, a hope she'd secretly harbored for years finally being extinguished. I'm so sorry, Chloe, I said, my voice thick. Did she really hate me that much? She whispered. And the question was like a physical blow. After all this time, to do that, to give it all to a church. And that's when my resolve hardened from granite into tempered steel. That was the moment, the catalyst. Eleanor didn't hate her. I knew that with every fiber of my being. This wasn't Eleanor's final word. It was Albright's. He hadn't just stolen her money. He had stolen her memory. He was trying to poison the love a mother had for her daughter, even from beyond the grave. No, I said, my voice suddenly firm, clear. No, she did not hate you, Chloe. She loved you. She loved you so much it broke her heart. I know it. She told me so. Many times. Then why? Because she was old, and she was sick, and she was lonely, and a very clever man took advantage of that. This wasn't your mother's decision. It was his. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her trying to process it. Then she told me something that made the whole sordid picture snap into focus. I tried to see her. You know, she said, her voice catching, about a month ago. I drove all the way up. I had to try one more time. I walked up to the door, and a woman I'd never seen before answered. She was very polite, said she was a volunteer from the church, helping Eleanor with her daily needs. She told me Mom was having a period of quiet spiritual contemplation and couldn't be disturbed. She said Pastor Albright had advised it. She took my number and said she'd have Mom call me when she was feeling stronger. She never got a call. Of course she didn't. They had put a guard at the gate, a polite, smiling guard, in the form of a church volunteer, blocking a daughter from her dying mother. It was methodical. It was cruel. It was evil. After I hung up with Chloe, I stood in my study for a long time, the empty glass in my hand. The initial shock had burned away, leaving behind something cold and pure, a quiet, burning purpose. A lawsuit would be messy. It would be Chloe's word against a man of God. It would drag on for years, costing a fortune and turning Eleanor's final days into a public spectacle. Chloe would be painted as a greedy, godless daughter, trying to steal from the poor box. Albright would play the martyr. He would win in the court of public opinion, even if he lost in a real court. No, a lawyer wasn't the right tool for this job. You don't use a hammer to perform surgery. You use a scalpel. I needed a different kind of weapon, one that could cut through the layers of piety and expose the rotten core beneath. I needed to fight this not in a courtroom, but in the light of day. It wasn't about revenge for me getting cut out as executor. It wasn't even, entirely, about the money for Chloe anymore. It was about the truth. It was about that monstrous lie. Did she really hate me that much? That Albright had planted in Chloe's heart. I would not let that be Eleanor's legacy. I walked over to my desk and sat down. I opened a drawer and pulled out a dusty old address book. Not a digital one, a real leather-bound book from a time when contacts were earned, not just collected. I flipped through the pages, past names of friends long gone, until I found the J section. And there it was, a name and a number I hadn't thought about in almost 15 years. Jenkins, Sarah, Herald reporter. My promise to Eleanor had been to make sure her daughter was taken care of. I now realized that meant more than just handing her the keys to a house. It meant giving her back the truth of her mother's love. It wasn't about revenge until it was, and now, it most certainly was. Asterisk. 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 The decision to sidestep the legal system wasn't born from a distrust of lawyers. I'm an engineer. I trust systems, processes, but I also know that any system can be gamed by someone who understands its weaknesses. Albright had insulated himself perfectly. A lawsuit would be a frontal assault on a fortified position. It would be bloody, protracted, and the outcome uncertain. I needed to find a back door. I needed to collapse the structure from within. My first call to Sarah Jenkins was a delicate operation. I couldn't just unload the whole sordid tale on a journalist I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. People do that all the time, I imagined, ranting about conspiracies and injustices. You have to sound sane. You have to sound credible. I remembered her from a case back in the early 2000s. I was still working, a senior engineer on a major municipal bridge project. I'd discovered that the primary contractor was using substandard steel, falsifying inspection reports to save a few $1,000,000. My superiors told me to sign off on it. To look the other way, I refused. I went to the press. Sarah Jenkins was a young, hungry reporter back then, cutting her teeth on the city desk. She was the only one who took me seriously. She listened. She dug. She understood the difference between a crackpot and a man with blueprints to prove his point. Her series of articles blew the whole thing wide open, won her a regional award, and got that bridge rebuilt with steel that wouldn't fail in a high wind. I remembered her tenacity. I was banking on the fact that she hadn't lost it. I dialed the number for the local Herald newsroom. I asked for her, and a gruff voice put me on hold. A few moments later, a woman's voice, sharp and hurried, came on the line. Sarah Jenkins. Sarah, you won't remember me. My name is Lawrence Collier. A pause. I could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard in the background. Lawrence Collier, the bridge guy? 15 years ago? I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The very same. I'm impressed, Sarah. I have a long memory for people who give me front-page stories, Lawrence, and for people who are right. What can I do for you? I hope you haven't found another faulty bridge. Something like that, I said. The structure is different, but the rot is the same. It's about a friend of mine who passed away recently. It involves a will, a church, and a pastor who I believe is engaged in, well, let's call it predatory philanthropy. The keyboard clicking stopped. I had her attention. The phrase was deliberate. It was professional. It wasn't the language of a rambling, grieving old man. It was the language of a problem statement. "That's a hell of a phrase, Lawrence," she said, her tone shifting from hurried to intrigued. "Tell me more." "Not over the phone," I said. "This requires documentation, blueprints, if you will. Can you meet?" We agreed to meet the next day at a small, out-of-the-way coffee shop, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and weak Wi-Fi, where no one would know either of us. Now I had a deadline. I had a meeting with an investigative reporter, and I couldn't walk in with just a sad story and a gut feeling. Gut feelings don't get printed. Data does. Evidence does. I needed to build a case. My engineering mind took over. What was the core of the problem? A last-minute change to a will under suspicious circumstances. Was it a one-time event, an anomaly, or was it a pattern? A predator, a true predator, rarely hunts just once. I needed to find other prey. Where to begin? The church. Evergreen Community Fellowship. I didn't want to go anywhere near the place. I didn't need to. In today's world, every organization, no matter how pious, has a digital footprint. I found their website easily. It was slick, professional. Lots of photos of a smiling Pastor Albright with his arm around happy-looking families. There was a section for their newsletter, an archive going back several years. I clicked on it, and there it was. My starting point. Each monthly newsletter had a section called "In His Loving Arms," a list of congregants who had recently passed away. It was an obituary page, wrapped in the language of faith. I opened a spreadsheet on my computer. In the first column, I typed Eleanor Vance. In the second, her date of passing. Then I started scrolling back through the newsletters, month by month. I was looking for a specific profile: elderly, recently widowed or living alone, long-time residents of the community, people with assets, people who might be lonely. It took me less than an hour to find the first one. Margaret Abernethy, died 6 months ago at 82. The newsletter eulogy was glowing, written by Pastor Albright himself, praising her quiet generosity and final profound act of faith. I remembered Margaret, a sweet woman, a retired librarian. Her husband, George, had died about a year before she did. I remembered Eleanor mentioning that Margaret was feeling lost without him, and that Pastor Albright had been visiting her frequently. I added her name to my spreadsheet. 20 minutes later, I found another. Beatrice Croft, 88. Passed away 10 months ago. Her husband had been gone for years. She'd been in and out of the hospital. The newsletter spoke of her peaceful transition and her joy at being able to give back to the church that gave her so much. Another name for the list. I had 3 names, 3 grieving, elderly women. All had received personal attention from the pastor. All had been praised for their generosity in death. It was a compelling narrative, but it was just that, a narrative. I needed proof. I needed to get my hands on their wills. I knew that probate records are for the most part public documents. The process is arcane, designed to discourage the casually curious, but the information is there if you're willing to do the work. The next morning, I drove down to the county records office, a dreary beige building that smelled of dust and bureaucracy. I felt a bit like a spy, a geriatric Jason Bourne on a mission fueled by instant coffee and indignation. I spent the entire day there. The clerk, a woman who looked profoundly bored, pointed me toward a row of computer terminals and gave me a set of instructions that were almost deliberately confusing. But I'm a man who once cross-referenced tens of thousands of structural calculations to find a single point of failure. A poorly designed user interface was not going to defeat me. I started with Margaret Abernethy. I typed in her name and date of death. A case file number appeared. I took that number to the clerk, who, after a sigh that suggested I was an immense burden on her day, disappeared into a back room. She returned a few minutes later with a thick accordion file folder. I took it to a small carrel and opened it. It was a mountain of paperwork, but I knew what I was looking for. I sifted through the legal documents, the lists of assets, the court filings, and then I found it. The will, and attached to the back with a staple, just like in Eleanor's case, was a single-page codicil. My heart started to pound. The codicil was dated 1 week before Margaret's death. It revoked a previous bequest to her only nephew, a man who lived out of state, and instead redirected the bulk of her estate, her house and a sizable stock portfolio, to the Evergreen Community Fellowship Church. And then I saw the signatures at the bottom, the witnesses. My blood ran cold. The names were James Petrov and Daniel Miller. I recognized them. They were two of Pastor Albright's most senior church elders, the same two men who had flanked him at Eleanor's funeral like loyal sentinels. I photocopied the entire file. Next, Beatrice Croft. The process was the same. I found her file. I found the will, and there it was again. A codicil signed 2 weeks before her death. This one didn't disinherit her children completely, but it amended the will to give the church a 50% stake in her family's long-held vacation home, a property that had been in their family for generations. And the witnesses who had signed the document, attesting to Beatrice's sound mind and body. James Petrov and Daniel Miller. I had it. The pattern, the method, the players. It wasn't just Eleanor. It was a system, a predatory machine designed to identify vulnerable targets, isolate them, and then extract their wealth under the cover of faith, all witnessed and legitimized by the same two loyal lieutenants. That afternoon, I met Sarah Jenkins. I'd chosen a booth in the back of the coffee shop. I bought 2 coffees and waited. She arrived right on time, looking older than I remembered. But her eyes were just as sharp, just as intelligent. She carried an oversized bag that looked heavy with a laptop and notebooks. "Lawrence," she said, sliding into the booth and giving me a wry smile. "You look like a man with a secret." "I'm a man with a spreadsheet," I said, and pushed a file folder across the table. I didn't start with the emotion. I didn't start with my promise to Eleanor. I started with the data. I laid it all out for her, the 3 names, the dates of death, the dates of the codicils. I showed her the photocopied probate records, highlighting the witness signatures. I showed her the church newsletters, with Albright's gushing praise for their final gifts. I laid out Eleanor's original will, the one I had a copy of, next to the single-page document that had replaced it. I created a timeline on a napkin, showing the pastor's involvement escalating as each woman's health declined. I watched her face as she looked through everything. She was silent for a long time, her reporter's mind connecting the dots, assessing the evidence. She picked up the photocopies of the witness signatures, comparing them. She looked at the identical vague wording in the codicils. Finally, she looked up at me, and the professional curiosity in her eyes had been replaced by a hard, steely glint. "This is more than a pattern, Lawrence," she said, her voice low. "This is a business model." "That's what I thought," I said. She leaned back in the booth, tapping a pen against her notebook. "This pastor, Albright, he's going to hide behind God. He'll say these were miracles, deathbed conversions of generosity. The families will be too scared or too embarrassed to fight a church." "I know," I said. "That's why I came to you. A courtroom is his territory. He's the home team. But public opinion, that's a different ball game. You can't object to a front-page story." A slow smile spread across her face. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a hunter who has just caught the scent of her favorite game. "Lawrence," she said, leaning forward, "let's go to work. Asterisk. 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 Our plan was a quiet insurgency, a campaign waged, not with subpoenas and depositions, but with phone calls and carefully phrased questions. Sarah was the field general, and I was her consigliere, the man with the institutional knowledge. My role was to provide the color, the context, the human details that would transform her data points into a living, breathing story of betrayal. Sarah's first move was brilliant in its simplicity. She didn't go anywhere near Pastor Albright or the church. That would have been like firing a warning shot. Instead, she started with the loose threads at the edge of the web, the disinherited families. She began with Marcus Abernathy, the nephew of the retired librarian. He was a high school history teacher in Arizona. When Sarah first called him, he was wary, defensive. He told her a story that was painfully familiar. He'd been close to his aunt his whole life, but in her final year it became harder and harder to reach her. When he'd call, one of the church helpers would often answer, saying Margaret was resting or praying. He'd been shocked by the will, but his local lawyer had told him that contesting it would be a costly uphill battle against a religious organization, and that he would likely be painted as a greedy nephew trying to defy his dear aunt's final holy wishes. He'd given up. He was resigned to it. Sarah told me over the phone after their conversation. He was more hurt than angry. He said the pastor made him feel like he was a bad person for even questioning it. That's the mechanism, I said. He uses piety as a shield and shame as a weapon. But then Sarah told Marcus something that changed his perspective entirely. She said, I am also speaking to the family of another woman, Beatrice Croft, and the family of Eleanor Vance. The circumstances of their wills are nearly identical to yours. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. For the first time, Marcus Abernathy realized he wasn't alone. He wasn't a solitary, greedy nephew. He was a victim in a pattern. His resignation began to curdle into anger. He agreed to speak on the record. We agreed to speak on the record. Next was Beatrice Croft's daughter, a woman named Helen who lived just 2 towns over. She was a tougher nut to crack. Her family was prominent, and she was terrified of the public embarrassment. But the vacation home was a deep, sentimental wound. It was where she and her brother had spent every summer of their childhoods. The idea of a smirking Pastor Albright, using it for church retreats, was a special kind of violation. I was able to help Sarah here. I remembered Eleanor mentioning that Beatrice had been feuding with her son over his divorce. It was a source of great pain for her. I relayed this to Sarah. Albright would have known about that. It was a fracture point he could have exploited, positioning the church as the more stable, more deserving heir than her own fractured family. When Sarah gently brought this up with Helen, suggesting that the pastor may have taken advantage of a moment of family turmoil, she heard a sharp intake of breath. The pieces clicked into place for Helen, too. She also agreed to talk. With the families tentatively on board, Sarah moved to the next circle of her investigation, the witnesses, James Petrov and Daniel Miller, the loyal elders. She didn't accuse them of anything. She just called them one after the other, posing as a reporter doing a feature story on the wonderful charitable work of the Evergreen Community Fellowship. She started with simple, friendly questions about the church's legacy gifting program. Then she moved to the specifics. My records show you were a witness to the signing of a codicil for Mrs. Eleanor Vance on October 14th. Do you recall that day? Petrov, the more garrulous of the two, was happy to talk. Oh yes, a beautiful moment. Sister Eleanor was so peaceful, so full of the spirit. And you also witnessed a similar signing for Mrs. Margaret Abernathy on April 2nd. A slight hesitation. Yes, I believe so. Our dear Pastor Albright relies on us to help with these final blessings. And for Mrs. Beatrice Croft last January. A longer pause this time. You know, you'd have to check with the pastor on the specific dates. We help so many of our flock in their time of need. The days can blend together. He was getting nervous. Sarah then called Daniel Miller and asked the same series of questions. Miller was more cautious, his answers clipped and vague. He claimed he couldn't recall the specifics of any of the signings without consulting the church records. The problem was, Sarah recorded both calls. When she played them back for me, the contrast was stark. Petrov's eager, conflicting memories versus Miller's stonewalling paranoia. It was beautiful. They hadn't coordinated their stories. They never imagined they'd need to. That was the first tremor that shook Albright's little kingdom. Petrov and Miller, no doubt terrified, would have run straight to their master. The pastor now knew that a reporter was sniffing around, and that she knew the names and the dates. The quiet war was over. The battle was about to begin. The first call from Albright came to my house that evening. I was in the kitchen making myself a sandwich when the phone rang. I saw his name on the caller ID, and I let it ring 3 times before I answered, just to let him wait. "Lawrence," he began, his voice a strained imitation of his usual warm baritone. There was an edge to it now, a tight wire of panic. "I've been made aware that you may be sharing some profound misunderstandings with members of the press. I've been sharing public records, Pastor," I said calmly, taking a bite of my sandwich. I wanted him to know how unbothered I was. Facts, dates, signatures, things an engineer can appreciate. "You are dishonoring Eleanor's memory," he snapped, the veneer of piety cracking. "She was a godly woman who made a godly choice. You are dragging her name through the mud. And for what? Out of some petty jealousy, because you were replaced as executor." I almost laughed. He was so predictable, always attacking the motive, never the facts. "I'm honoring the memory of the Eleanor I knew for 40 years, Pastor," I said, my voice dropping, becoming as cold and hard as the granite in my countertops. "The woman who loved her daughter more than anything. The woman who would never have disinherited her child. You and I both know that the person who signed that piece of paper wasn't the real Eleanor Vance." There was a sputtering on the other end of the line. "This is slander. This is an attack on my ministry, on God's work." "Is it God's work to have church volunteers block a daughter from seeing her dying mother?" I asked. The silence on his end was absolute. I had him. I knew from Chloe that he'd orchestrated that particular cruelty. It was the one detail that wasn't in any public record. It was the one thing he didn't know that I knew. I heard him take a shaky breath. "You are making a grave mistake, Lawrence," he whispered, and now it was a pure threat. "No," I said, and I leaned against the counter, feeling a strange sense of calm. "The grave mistake was made when you underestimated a grieving daughter, and when you forgot that I was Eleanor's friend." I hung up the phone. The panic had now officially set in. Albright, realizing I was immune to his threats, and that Sarah had the other families on board, made his next desperate move. He called Chloe. He tried to turn her, using the only weapon he had left, spiritual blackmail. Chloe called me right after, her voice shaking but furious. He told me I was endangering my mother's soul by siding with forces of darkness. He said I was spitting on her grave. He said the church was praying for me, to lead me away from my greed and my bitterness. "Did you record it, Chloe?" I asked, my heart pounding, like I suggested. "Every word," she said. I smiled. It was a genuine smile, the first one I'd felt in weeks. He was so arrogant, so sure of his own power, that he was now actively, eagerly handing us the rope to hang him with. The silent takeover was complete. He didn't know it yet, but he was already a ghost. His pristine, holy fortress was a hollow shell, and we were just about to kick in the door. Asterisk. Asterisk. A first sign that the power had truly shifted wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a legal notice. It was much quieter than that. It was the sound of money walking away. Sarah's investigation, while not yet public, had sent ripples through the placid pond of the Evergreen Community Fellowship. The families of Margaret Abernathy and Beatrice Croft, now united and emboldened, had begun to talk. Not to the press. Not yet. They talked to their friends, their neighbors, people they sat next to in the pews every Sunday. The story spread not like a wildfire, but like a rising tide seeping into the foundations of Albright's authority. It was whispered over coffee after service, discussed in hushed tones during book club meetings, and debated in the privacy of living rooms. The official story was still that Pastor Albright was a blessed man leading a blessed church. But the unofficial story, the one with the ring of truth, was that he was a predator who targeted the elderly and the grieving. The first concrete blow came from the Henderson family. They were an older couple, pillars of the church for 50 years, who had pledged a substantial sum, rumored to be $250,000, for the new community outreach wing that Albright was so proud of. It was his crowning achievement, the physical monument to his success. One Tuesday morning, Arthur Henderson, a man as quiet and solid as the oak trees he admired, hand-delivered a letter to the church office. It was a single polite paragraph stating that due to a reassessment of their philanthropic goals, they were withdrawing their pledge, effective immediately. It was a devastating blow, and it was only the beginning. The church's finances were largely dependent on a core group of wealthy, older members who tithed faithfully. One by one, they began to quietly turn off the tap. Automatic monthly donations were canceled. Estate plans were revisited. The flow of money that Albright had come to see as his divine right slowed to a trickle. The pews on Sunday morning started to look a little sparse. A few empty spots became a whole row. A family that had attended for 3 generations was suddenly on vacation. The choir felt smaller, the hymns a little thinner. It was a silent, bloodless exodus. Albright, watching his life's work crumble, panicked. He did what all cornered narcissists do. He played the victim. The following Sunday he took to the pulpit, not with a sermon but with a jeremiad. His face, usually arranged in a beatific smile, was a mask of righteous fury. His voice, usually so smooth and calming, was sharp with anger. "There is a sickness in our midst," he thundered, his fist hitting the lectern, "a poison of gossip and slander spread by those with bitter hearts and greedy souls. The devil is at work, my friends, trying to tear down what we have built. He is whispering lies into the ears of the faithless, turning them against your shepherd." He never mentioned me by name, or Sarah, or any of the families. He didn't have to. Everyone knew who he was talking about. He was trying to rally his base, to create an army of defenders who would see this as a holy war. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. For the members who were already loyal to him, it was a call to arms. They nodded in agreement, their faces grim. But for the vast majority, the ones on the fence, the ones who had heard the whispers and felt a growing unease, it was the final straw. They hadn't come to church to be yelled at, to be drafted into a war against their neighbors. They had come for peace, for community, and instead of addressing the serious allegations with transparency and grace, the pastor was throwing a tantrum from the pulpit. He looked less like a persecuted saint and more like a guilty man, desperate and flailing. I wasn't there to see it, but my phone started ringing that afternoon. It was Richard, a retired accountant and an old friend from my Rotary Club, who was also a member of Albright's church. He had always been skeptical of the pastor's slick style. "Lawrence," he said, his voice grim, "I think you should know. Today was a spectacle. He's lost it. He all but called for a witch hunt against anyone who questions him. My wife and I, we walked out right in the middle of it. We're done." That was the power shift. The moment his spiritual authority collapsed under the weight of his own hubris, he had tried to use his pulpit as a shield, but instead it had become a spotlight, illuminating his panic for all to see. His desperate countermoves were only digging his hole deeper. He tried to have the church's lawyer, a junior partner at Patterson's firm, send a threatening cease and desist letter to the Herald. Sarah told me the paper's legal department read it, looked at the mountain of evidence she had compiled, the probate records, the recorded phone calls, the on-the-record testimony from 3 different families, and sent back a polite one-sentence reply telling them to get lost. Albright was isolated. His money was drying up. His flock was scattering. His legal threats were empty. He was a king with no subjects, a general with no army, and all the while Sarah was typing. She was polishing the sentences, fact-checking the details, and preparing the weapon that would finally bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. The silent takeover was a success. Now all that was left was the demolition. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The story broke on a Sunday, the one day of the week Pastor Albright considered his own. It wasn't tucked away in the metro section. It was on the front page, above the fold. The headline was stark, brutal and beautiful in its simplicity. Holy heist. Investigation reveals pattern of predatory philanthropy at Evergreen Fellowship. Sarah had outdone herself. The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, cold, factual, and utterly devastating. It didn't scream. It simply presented the evidence with the calm, irrefutable logic of a mathematical proof. It laid out the timeline for Eleanor, for Margaret Abernathy, for Beatrice Croft. It detailed the last-minute codicils, the identical witnesses, the sudden disinheritance of family members. It included tasteful, heartbreaking quotes from Chloe, from Marcus Abernathy, and from Helen Croft, each telling their story of being stonewalled and isolated. It even included a section on the lawyer, Patterson, noting his firm's sudden increase in probate work originating from a single church. And most damningly, it featured a transcript of Albright's threatening, spiritually abusive phone call to Chloe, placed next to his official, smarmy statement about honoring the sacred wishes of the departed. The hypocrisy was laid bare for the entire city to see. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Albright. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by the national news wires. The regional synod of his denomination, which had previously ignored quiet complaints about Albright's high-flying lifestyle, was now facing a public relations nightmare. They couldn't ignore a front-page exposé. They announced a full, formal investigation into the pastor and the finances of the Evergreen Community Fellowship. Pastor Albright was placed on indefinite administrative leave. His smiling face was scrubbed from the church website. The district attorney's office, which deals with political reality just as much as legal reality, saw the tide of public opinion and launched its own criminal investigation into potential elder fraud and undue influence. Patterson, the lawyer with the nervous eyes, had his license suspended by the State Bar Association pending an ethics review. The house of cards collapsed, just as I knew it would. There was no big dramatic confrontation. I never saw Pastor Albright again. There was no shouting match, no moment of him shaking his fist and cursing my name. His defeat was quiet, bureaucratic, and total. He was erased. That, to me, was a far more satisfying victory. He was a man who craved the spotlight, and his punishment was to be cast into darkness. The real moment of vindication came a few weeks later. The court had appointed a neutral third-party administrator to manage Eleanor's estate while the legal challenges played out. The locks on her house were changed, and the volunteers from the church were long gone. The administrator gave Chloe the key. She called me and asked me to go with her. We walked up the path to the house where she had grown up, the place she thought she had lost forever. It was a crisp autumn day, and the leaves on the old oak tree in the front yard were a brilliant shade of gold. It was quiet, peaceful. Chloe turned the key in the lock, and we stepped inside. The air was still and smelled faintly of lavender and old books. It was Eleanor's smell. It was like stepping into a memory. Everything was just as she had left it. Her reading glasses were on the side table. The Afghan Martha had made was still folded neatly over the back of her favorite chair. Chloe walked through the room slowly, her hand trailing along the furniture. She wasn't crying. She was just absorbing it, reclaiming it. She went to her mother's jewelry box, a small lacquered chest on the dresser. She opened it and sifted through the contents. Then she stopped. She lifted out a small silver locket on a delicate chain. She opened it. On one side was a tiny faded picture of her as a little girl, all pigtails and missing teeth. On the other side was a picture of her mother, young and smiling. She told me about this locket. I said softly, "The week before she died." She was confused, but she remembered this. She said, "I want Chloe to have this, so she remembers." Chloe closed her hand around the locket, her knuckles white. She looked at me, and her eyes were filled with a kind of sad, profound relief. The poison was gone. The horrible question that Albright had planted in her heart, did she really hate me that much, had finally been answered. "Thank you, Lawrence," she whispered. Her voice was thick with emotion, but it was strong. "You gave her back to me." We didn't talk much more after that. We just stood there in the quiet house, a house full of memories that no longer felt stolen. The legal battle would be long, but it was just a formality now. The war was over. The truth had won. My promise to Eleanor was fulfilled. It wasn't about the house or the money or the revenge. It was about this moment, this quiet, simple silver locket. It was about making sure that the last word in Eleanor's story was not a lie written by a thief, but the truth of a mother's love. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It's been about a year now since the story broke. The world keeps turning, as it does. The wheels of justice, however, turn much more slowly, but they do turn. The wills of Eleanor, Margaret, and Beatrice were all invalidated by the court on the grounds of undue influence. The evidence Sarah and I had gathered was so overwhelming that Albright's lawyers, once they realized they couldn't just bully their way through, advised the church synod to settle. Chloe has her mother's house now. She started the slow, bittersweet process of sorting through a lifetime of memories, deciding what to keep, what to pass on. The other families received their rightful inheritances as well. As for Pastor Dean Albright, he's gone, he vanished. Some say he moved to Florida to start a new ministry under a different name, looking for a new flock to fleece. I hope that's not true. I prefer to think of him living in some drab, anonymous apartment, his expensive suits gathering dust, his brilliant white teeth yellowing slightly, his smile no longer a weapon but just a sad grimace in the mirror. His name is now a cautionary tale. In this town, a synonym for hypocrisy. The Evergreen Community Fellowship Church still exists, but under a new name, with new leadership appointed by the synod. Its finances are under a microscope. The grand community outreach wing was never built. Instead, they're focusing on smaller, quieter acts of charity, trying to rebuild the trust that their former pastor shattered. I see Chloe for coffee every few weeks. The sadness in her eyes has been replaced by a quiet strength. We don't talk about Albright much anymore. We talk about her kids, about the garden she's planning for her mother's backyard, about the funny things Eleanor used to say. We talk about the real Eleanor, the one I knew and loved. Her legacy is safe now. Looking back on it all, I realize this was never a story about a brilliant plan. I'm just an old engineer who knows how to read a blueprint and spot a faulty foundation. I saw a structure that was rotten to its core, and I pointed it out to someone who knew how to bring it down safely and efficiently. It wasn't about revenge, not in the way you see in the movies. There was no explosion, no public humiliation in the town square. It was about a quiet correction. It was about balancing the books. A promise was made, and a promise was kept. That's it. But I've learned something through all of this. I've learned that evil isn't always loud and monstrous. Sometimes it's quiet, it's charming. It wears a nice suit and speaks in a soothing voice. It finds the cracks in your heart, your grief, your loneliness, your regrets, and it slowly, patiently wedges them open until your whole world falls apart. These predators, they count on our silence. They count on our politeness. They count on our reluctance to make a scene, our fear of being seen as difficult or greedy. They build their kingdoms in the shadows of our quiet despair. But they have a weakness. They are fundamentally arrogant. They believe they are smarter than everyone else. They underestimate the quiet, stubborn persistence of an old man who misses his friend. They underestimate the power of a single, well-documented fact. They forget that the truth, no matter how deeply you bury it, has a way of working its way to the surface. So if you're listening to this, I want you to remember that. You don't need an army to fight back. You don't need a fortune. Sometimes all you need is a clear eye, a steady hand, and the conviction that some things are just plain wrong. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is the decision to no longer be silent. Have you ever seen something like this happen in your own life? A person in a position of trust who took advantage of the vulnerable? Let me know in the comments below. I read them all, and I find that sharing our stories is how we build a stronger community. It's how we warn each other where the predators are hiding. If you found this story meaningful, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories to tell. There are always more stories. Thank you for listening.